enough hot air in you to blow up that blimp.
When I get back tonight, I'll wake you for a little post-game wrap-up.
The car?
Oh, there's not a scratch on it.
But you did hit something.
A BMW.
Couldn't you have hit an American car?
Well, honey, if I could have, I would have.
It is about my, fiancé, Carlos. You have a fiancé? Well, when did this happen? When I was 4.
1985. A middle-aged black woman is sitting on the steps of an apartment building in Washington, D.C., watching the neighborhood, ready to comment on everyone's life. This character, Mary Jenkins, played by Marla Gibbs, was about to become one of the most beloved icons of American television. The show was called 227, and for 5 seasons it did something few programs managed. It showed the real life of middle-class black families with humor, dignity, and authenticity. And look, before continuing with this incredible story, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week I bring stories of shows and personalities who changed culture and deserve to be remembered. I guarantee you won't want to miss the next one. Now tell me something. Did you watch 227? Remember Mary Jenkins at the building's door, Sandra Clark with those exaggerated outfits, little Brenda Jenkins? Comment down below, because this is a story about representation, about breaking barriers, about a show that proved audiences of all races wanted to see black families living normal lives, facing normal problems, being funny without becoming caricatures. So get ready, because we're diving into the story of how a small show based on a theater play became a cultural phenomenon that opened doors for an entire generation. The story of 227 begins long before 1985. It begins with a woman named Christine Houston. Christine was a writer and actress who in 1978 wrote a play with the same name, 227, based on her own experiences living in an apartment building in Washington, D.C. The play was about the residents of this building, their interconnected lives, their dramas, their joys, their gossip. It was comedy, but it was comedy rooted in truth, in real observation of how real people lived. The play was a success in the black theater circuit, being presented in cities all over the country, and eventually it caught the attention of television producers who saw potential to transform it into a sitcom. But here's the thing. We're talking about the 80s, a time when American television was dominated by shows with white casts. The Cosby Show had premiered in 1984 and was proving that a show about an upper-middle-class black family could be a massive success. But there was still skepticism in the industry about whether white audiences would watch shows focused on black characters. But NBC decided to take a risk. They bought the rights to Christine Houston's play and began developing the show. And this is where Marla Gibbs comes in, an actress who was already known and loved for her role as Florence, the sarcastic maid on The Jeffersons. Marla had spent years in that role, making audiences laugh with her perfect comic timing and sharp responses. But she wanted more. She wanted a role where she could be the center, where she could show all her dimensions as an actress, where she could play a complex and real woman, not just a supporting character. Mary Jenkins in 227 was exactly that. Mary was a housewife, wife of Lester Jenkins, who worked as a construction worker, mother of Brenda, a smart teenager. Mary was a gossip, always knew everything that happened in the building, was always on the front steps, watching and commenting. But she was also the moral heart of the building, the person everyone turned to when they had problems, the conflict mediator, the loyal friend. It was a three-dimensional character, funny but also deep, imperfect, but fundamentally good. And Marla Gibbs brought all her experience and talent to this role. She wasn't just reciting lines, she was creating a real person, someone audiences recognized, who reminded them of their own mothers or aunts or neighbors. Mary Jenkins became instantly iconic, with her facial expressions, her way of speaking, her way of looking at people when they were doing something she disapproved of. But 227 wasn't just about Mary. The show had a fantastic cast that created perfect dynamics. Hal Williams played Lester Jenkins, Mary's husband, a hard-working, kind man who loved his wife, but sometimes got tired of her gossip and interference. Their relationship was beautiful because it was real. They fought sometimes, got irritated with each other, but you always saw the underlying love and respect. Rose Holloway, played by Elena Reed Hall, was Mary's best friend, a more elegant and refined woman who sometimes got exasperated with Mary's gossip, but was completely loyal to her. Their friendship was the emotional heart of the show, showing black women supporting each other, laughing together, navigating life together. Pearl Shea, played by Helen Martin, was the oldest tenant, a lady in her 80s, sarcastic, unfiltered, always saying exactly what she thought without caring about consequences. She was hilarious, but also represented wisdom, connection with previous generations, reminders that the black community had a long and rich history. And then there was Sandra Clark, played by Jackée Harry, and man, Sandra deserves her own paragraph because she became a phenomenon. Sandra was the sexy neighbor, the woman who wore tight and provocative clothes, who dated different men constantly, who was confident in her sexuality in a way that was rare for black women on television at the time. She could have been just a caricature, just the easy woman for jokes. But Jackée Harry brought so much humanity, so much charm, so much intelligence to the role that Sandra became beloved. And here's something revolutionary. Sandra was never punished for her sexuality. In many shows of that era, a character like Sandra would be morally judged, would have to learn a lesson, would have to change her ways. But on 2 and 27, Sandra was simply who she was, and that was okay. Mary sometimes disapproved, made comments, but they were friends, and the show made it clear that women could make different choices and all be valid. That was radical for 80s television. Jackée Harry became so popular that in 1987 she won the Emmy for Best Supporting Actress in Comedy, becoming the first African-American woman to win in that category. Let that sink in. In all of television history up to that point, no black woman had been recognized with an Emmy for comedic acting. Jackée broke that barrier, and she did it playing a character who was sexual, confident, and completely unapologetic. And there's another crucial element of 227 that needs to be highlighted. Brenda Jenkins, the teenage daughter of Mary and Lester, played by a young actress named Regina King. Yes, that Regina King, the same one who decades later would win an Oscar, who would become one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. She started on 227 when she was only 14 years old, playing a normal teenager dealing with school, friends, first relationships, conflicts with parents. And even so young, you could see the talent, the presence, the emotional depth that would eventually make her a star. The show premiered in September 1985 and was an immediate success. Audiences loved it. Critics praised it. And here's what was especially significant. White audiences watched as much as black audiences. The show was proving what The Cosby Show had begun to prove, that when you tell universal human stories with well-developed characters, race doesn't matter. People will connect. Because in the end, 227 was about community, about neighbors caring for each other, about extended family, about the small dramas and joys of everyday life. Yes, it was specifically about a black community in Washington, D.C., and it never tried to hide or minimize that. The experiences, the dialogues, the cultural references were authentically black. But the themes, the emotions, the relationship dynamics were universal. Each episode was a small lesson about life, but never in a preachy or condescending way. Mary might learn about not being so gossipy. Brenda would learn about responsibility or about choosing good friends. Lester would learn about communication in marriage. Rose would learn about not being so rigid. Sandra would learn about vulnerability and letting people in. But these lessons always came through comedy, through situations that made you laugh while making you think. And the show dealt with serious issues too. There were episodes about racism, about economic hardship, about education, about interracial relationships, about peer pressure, about drugs. Not very often because it was primarily a comedy, but when it dealt with these topics, it did so with care and respect, showing how black families and communities actually navigated these challenges. One thing that made 227 special was its setting. The apartment building, with those front steps where Mary was always sitting, became as iconic as any character. Those steps represented community, represented the space where people connected, where life happened. In many urban communities, especially black communities, the front steps, the porch, the hallway, These were the social spaces where neighbors became family, where children played under the watchful eye of multiple adults, where gossip and news and support circulated. 227 captured that perfectly, and for many people watching, especially black people who had grown up in similar environments, it was deeply nostalgic and true. It was seeing their own lives reflected on television in a way that rarely happened. During its 5 seasons from 1985 to 1990, 227 was consistently popular. It was never the #1 show, but it had a loyal and consistent fan base. Saturday night on NBC, people tuned in to spend half an hour with Mary and her neighbors, to laugh, to feel part of that community. But like many shows, it eventually faced challenges. Audiences began to drop a bit in the 5th season. The network wanted to make changes. There was pressure to update the format, to attract younger audiences. And in 1990, NBC decided to cancel the show. Not because it had failed, but because television was changing, new shows were coming, and networks are always chasing the next big thing. The final episode aired in May 1990, and it was bittersweet. Fans were sad to see the show end, but grateful for 5 years of laughter and stories. The cast was ready to move on, pursue new projects, but also nostalgic for the family they had created during those years. And here's something important to understand about the legacy of 227. It opened doors. The show's success, along with The Cosby Show and A Different World and other shows of that era, definitively proved that audiences wanted to see diversity on television, that stories about black families and communities were commercially viable, that black actors could carry shows and win awards and become stars. Jackée Harry became a star after 227, continued working in television and theater for decades. Regina King, as I mentioned, became one of the most respected actresses of her generation, winning multiple Emmys and eventually an Oscar. Marla Gibbs continued working, made appearances on countless shows, became a legend in the black entertainment community, and the show itself, even decades later, is remembered fondly. People who grew up in the 80s and 90s talk about watching 227 with their families, about how the characters seemed real, about how the stories reflected their own lives. There's a powerful nostalgia associated with the show, a feeling that it represented a simpler time, but also a time where community and family meant something, where neighbors knew and cared about each other. And here's something that young people today might not fully understand. Seeing 227 in the 80s, if you were a black child or teenager, was significant in a way that's hard to express, because you saw people who looked like you, who spoke like your families spoke, who lived in environments that seemed familiar, being portrayed with dignity and humor and complexity. You saw that your experiences mattered, that your stories were worth telling, that you weren't invisible. Representation matters. That phrase is repeated so much today that it sometimes loses its impact, but it's profoundly true. When you never see yourself reflected in media, when all the stories are about people who don't look like you, who don't share your experiences, it sends a message that you don't matter, that your stories have no value. And when you finally see yourself, when characters who look like you are central, complex, beloved, it changes something fundamental in how you see yourself and how you see your place in the world. 227 was part of a larger movement in the 80s that was beginning to change American television. Not fast enough, not completely, but it was beginning. And each show that succeeded made it easier for the next one to be made, for more doors to be opened, for more voices to be heard. But let's be honest about the challenges too. Even while 227 was on the air, even while it was successful, the creators and actors faced constant pressure. Network executives sometimes wanted them to be less specifically black, more universal, which really meant more white, more palatable to white audiences. There were suggestions to add white characters to the main cast, to change certain cultural references, to soften certain aspects. And to the credit of Christine Houston, Marla Gibbs, the cast and crew, they resisted many of these pressures. They maintained the show's authenticity, kept it rooted in the black experience, refused to dilute their vision just to make nervous executives feel more comfortable. And the fact that the show was successful while doing this proved they were right, that authenticity resonates, that you don't need to apologize or become more palatable to succeed. There were also financial challenges. Like many black actors of the time, the cast of 227 was often paid less than their white counterparts on similar shows. They had to fight for every raise, had to prove their worth repeatedly in ways that white actors didn't. It was unfair, it was frustrating, but it was the reality of the industry at the time, and unfortunately it's still a reality for many actors of color today. But despite these challenges, 227 persisted, maintained its quality, maintained its authenticity, and left a legacy that lasts to this day. When you watch modern shows like Blackish or The Neighborhood or Insecure, you're seeing the direct descendants of 227 and other shows from that era. You're seeing the fruits of the seeds that were planted in the 80s by people who refused to accept that black stories were niche or not commercial. And there's something else that needs to be said about 227. It was genuinely funny. With all this discussion about representation and cultural significance, we can't forget that at the center of everything, it was a well-written, well-acted comedy with perfect timing and jokes that worked. Mary Jenkins on the steps with that judgmental look. Sandra Clark entering with a tight dress and a new boyfriend. Pearl Shea making a devastating sarcastic comment. Brenda rolling her eyes at her mother. Lester trying to avoid another gossip session. All these moments were funny not because they were forced or exaggerated, but because they were real, true, perfectly observed. The show's writers, many of whom were black, understood comedy rhythm, understood their characters deeply, knew how to build a joke, how to do a callback, how to balance funny moments with emotional moments. And the actors, led by the always brilliant Marla Gibbs, knew how to deliver these lines, how to find humor in the simplest situations, how to make a look or a pause worth more than a page of dialogue. The direction was also consistently good, knowing when to let a scene breathe, when to speed up, how to capture characters' reactions, how to use the limited set creatively. Sitcoms filmed in studio with live audience like 227 have specific challenges, and the 227 crew mastered that format. And the theme song, sung by the group The Voices of East Harlem, was perfect. That gospel choir, those powerful voices singing about love and community, set the tone immediately. You heard that music and knew you were about to enter that building, that community. Spend time with those people you had learned to love. So when we look at 227 decades later, what do we see? We see a show that was simultaneously a product of its time and timeless. The clothes, the hairstyles, some of the references are dated, but the stories, the characters, the emotions remain relevant. Questions about community, about family, about friendship, about navigating life with humor and grace, these are eternal. We see a show that took risks, that refused to be what television executives wanted it to be, that maintained authenticity even when it was harder. We see a show that gave opportunities for black actors to shine, that launched the career of a future Oscar winner, that proved talent and good stories transcend race. We see a show that made millions of people laugh, that provided comfort and joy, that created moments families shared together, that became part of the collective cultural memory of a generation. And we see a show that mattered, that meant something, that had lasting impact on how television represents diversity. If you've never watched 227, or if you watched it as a child and don't completely remember, it's worth revisiting. Episodes are available streaming on various platforms. Watch a few episodes. Let yourself enter that building in Washington, D.C. Meet Mary Jenkins and her neighbors. Laugh at the situations, appreciate the cast's chemistry, see how comedy can be intelligent and meaningful at the same time. And when you watch, think about the context, about what it meant to have a show like this on the air in the 80s, about the doors it opened, about the young black actors and writers and directors who saw 227 and thought, I can do this. My stories can be told. There's room for me in this industry. 227 may not have been perfect. No show is. It had weaker episodes, moments that didn't work, questionable creative choices. But in its totality, it was an important show, a well-made show, a show that deserves to be remembered and celebrated. Marla Gibbs, who was at the center of everything, deserves special recognition. She took a role that could have been one-dimensional, the gossipy neighbor, and transformed it into something rich and human. Mary Jenkins was imperfect, sometimes interfered too much, sometimes judged too quickly, but was fundamentally good, fundamentally loving, fundamentally the heart of her community. And Marla brought so much dignity, so much humor, so much life to this role that Mary became unforgettable. So here's to 227, to Mary Jenkins and Sandra Clark and Rose Holloway and Pearl Shea and Lester Jenkins and Brenda Jenkins and all the characters who passed through that building over 5 seasons. Here's to the writers and directors and all the crew who worked hard to make each episode shine. Here's to Christine Houston, who wrote the original play and fought to keep her vision intact. And here's to all the people who watched, who laughed, who saw themselves reflected on that screen, who felt seen and valued and included. 227 was more than just a sitcom. It was a declaration that black stories matter, that black communities are rich and complex and worthy of being centered, not marginalized. It was proof that representation isn't just politics or obligation. It's good art, it's good television, it's what audiences want. And it was a reminder that shared laughter, community, human connection, these are the things that really matter, regardless of race or class or where you live. Now tell me in the comments, did you watch 227? Who was your favorite character? Do you remember any specific episode? And if you never watched, are you going to look for it now? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every week we bring stories like this of shows and people who changed culture and deserve to be remembered. Until next time, and remember, community matters, representation matters, and laughing together is one of the most powerful things we can do.